The bell of Saint-Roch was striking one when Etienne Vasseur opened his eyes in the dark and lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet of the room above the shop. His wife Marguerite breathed evenly beside him, turned toward the wall, one hand curled near her chin the way it had been every night of their marriage. He did not wake her. She would rise in 3 hours, when the work below was already deep in its rhythm, and until then the whole weight of the night belonged to him alone. He swung his legs from under the quilt and set his feet on the cold floorboards, and the cold went up through him like water poured slowly from a jug. The room smelled of the day before, of flour that had drifted up the stairwell and settled into the curtains, of the tallow candle guttered out on the washstand, of Marguerite's hair. He dressed in the dark by habit, not needing a light for it. The coarse linen shirt gone soft and pale from 100 washings, the drawstring trousers, the apron rolled and tucked under one arm to be tied downstairs where the real work waited. His feet found his sabots by the door without his eyes needing to guide them, the wood cool and hollow-sounding on the boards. On the landing, he paused, as he always did, to look in on the sound of the city through the shuttered window. Paris at 1 in the morning was not silent. It never was. Not truly, not even in the coldest months. But it kept a different voice at this hour, low and private, a voice meant for the few who were awake to hear it. Somewhere off toward the river, a dog barked twice and gave it up. Under the window, the street lay gray-blue in the light of the gas lamp on the corner, its flame small and steady inside its glass, and the cobbles beneath it shone faintly with the damp that came every night to Paris in high summer, laid down like a blessing and burned off again by 9. He went down the back stair to the fornal, the bakehouse, and the temperature changed before the light did. Heat first, not the fierce heat of midday work, not yet, but the low-banked warmth of a room that never fully cooled, a cellar that had held fire in its bones for longer than Etienne had been alive to feel it. He struck a match against the stone sill and lit the oil lamp that hung from its hook by the door, and the little room came up around him in pieces, the great black bulk of the oven filling the whole of the far wall, its mouth a dark arch taller than a man's knee and wider than his outstretched arms. The pétrin, the kneading trough, squat and battered on its 4 thick legs, scarred pale along its rim where 40 years of dough had been turned and folded and dragged against the wood. The sacks of flour stacked along the near wall, their linen gone gray with handling, the shelf of baskets, the long-handled peels leaning in the corner like fishing poles put up for the night, their wood worn to a shine at the grip. The smell was the thing that struck him first every night and struck him still after 11 years in this cellar, as though he had never smelled it before. Flour, always flour, a smell like nothing else, dry and faintly sweet, a little like straw, a little like the inside of a nut. Under it, the deeper, sourer breath of the levain crock in its warm corner near the oven, the wild yeast that had been kept alive in this room since before Etienne's own father had taken the shop, fed and coaxed, and never once let go cold. It smelled tart and winey and alive, like bread that had not yet decided to become bread. And under both of these, the cold ash smell of the oven's belly, waiting to be swept and fed and made hot again, as it had been made hot every night for longer than any man now living could say with certainty. He crossed to the levain crock first, as he always did, and lifted the cloth that covered it. It had risen well in the night's rest. the surface domed and pocked with small bubbles, and when he pressed 2 fingers gently against it, the dent sprang back slow and soft, the way a good levain should. He breathed it in, that sharp, clean sourness, more honest to him than any perfume, and felt the small private satisfaction that came every night at this moment, the sense of a living thing handed down to him, and still, this morning, as every morning, alive and willing. His father had kept this same culture, feeding it flour and water in the same wooden crock, and his father's father before that, if the story told in the family was to be trusted, though 11 years was surely enough for Etienne to call it his own without disloyalty. He set aside a portion of the levain into the earthenware pot he would carry to the trough, and refreshed what remained with fresh flour and water, working it in with 2 fingers until it had the consistency he wanted, neither too stiff nor too slack, and covered it again and left it to its own devices until tomorrow night asked something of it once more. Then to the oven. This was the part of the work that could not be hurried and could not, in 11 years, ever quite be reduced to habit. Each night the fire had its own temper, and a baker who forgot that would burn his bread or starve it, and either way shame himself in front of his own customers by mid-morning. He knelt at the mouth of the oven with the long iron rake and drew out what remained of the old ash, the cold gray dust of the last firing, careful and unhurried, sweeping it into the pail kept for the purpose. The ash went out to a corner of the courtyard where it did no one any harm, and sometimes, in truth, did the courtyard's small patch of green some good. When the floor of the oven was swept clean, he ran his palm flat along the brick to be sure, feeling for grit, for anything that might mar a loaf's underside. He began to build the new fire. He liked this part of the work, though he would not have called it liking to another man. It seemed too plain a word for the satisfaction of it. He laid the kindling first, thin, dry splinters saved in a basket by the hearth, and over them the faggots of split wood, bundled and stacked along the wall since autumn, oak mostly, sometimes beech, chosen and dried through a whole season for exactly this purpose. He built the fire the way his father had shown him, a loose lattice that would draw air and catch quick and burn even, and when it was laid, he touched the lit taper to the kindling and watched the small flame take, uncertain at first, then steady, then eager, climbing up through the lattice of wood until the whole mouth of the oven glowed and the low room filled with the sweet resinous smell of burning oak, mixed now with the flour smell and the levain smell into something that was, to Etienne, simply the smell of his own life. He fed the fire a while, crouched before it with the poker resting easy in his hand, feeling the heat push out against his face and forearms in waves, watching the wood settle and crack and throw up small orange sparks that died before they reached the low ceiling. The light of it moved on the floured walls, on the sacks, on the trough, on the long shadow of himself thrown huge and wavering across the room, and for these minutes, before Julian arrived, before the trough needed him, before the whole machinery of the night's baking came properly awake, Etienne allowed himself simply to sit with the fire and be warmed by it, a man alone with his oven in the deep dark of the city, doing the same thing his father had done and his father's father in the same cellar, by the same kind of light. Somewhere above him, faint through the floorboards, he heard Marguerite turn over in her sleep. He smiled without quite knowing he did it, and rose and went to fetch the flour. By 1:30 the fire had settled into the long, steady burn that would carry it through the better part of an hour, and Etienne turned from the oven to the trough, wiping his hands on his apron, though there was nothing yet on them to wipe. The pétrin stood waist-high, a great hollowed box of oak gone dark and glossy along its inner curves where dough had been worked against it for decades, and he ran his hand once along its rim the way another man might touch a door-frame on entering a house he loved. He heard Julien on the stair before he saw him, the particular scuff and thump of a boy of 14, coming down steps 2 at a time and catching himself late, a sound Etienne had come to listen for the way a farmer listens for the cock. Julien Ferrand had been his mitron, his apprentice, for 1 year and 4 months now, indentured to him by his mother, a widow in the Rue des Bons Enfants, who took in washing and had 6 other mouths, besides Julien's, to feed. The boy came into the fournil, rubbing one eye with the heel of his hand, his hair standing up on one side where the pillow had pressed it, his nightshirt still visible beneath the shirt he had pulled on in haste. "You're a quarter hour later than yesterday," Etienne said, without heat, already turning back to the flour sacks. "I was awake at 1, Julien said, aggrieved, tying his apron with the quick, practiced knot Etienne had taught him. "I only lay there thinking I had a few minutes yet." "A few minutes is how a man loses an hour." But Etienne said it mildly, the way he said most things to the boy, and Julien, who had learned by now to hear the difference between his master's teaching voice and his scolding voice, the second of which Etienne almost never used, only grunted and reached for the scoop. They worked the flour together into the trough, Julien holding the sack steady, while Etienne judged the weight of each scoopful more by feel than by any scale, though a small iron balance stood on a shelf nearby, for the mornings when precision mattered more than instinct, a new order, a larger batch, a customer's particular commission. Tonight was an ordinary night, and Etienne trusted his hands. He had been filling this trough since he was younger than Julien was now, first as his own father's mitron, and then when his father's knees had given out and his father's eyes had begun to fail him for the fine judgments of heat and time, as the master of the shop himself. 11 years he had owned the lease outright, 26 years, if a man counted from the first morning his father had stood him on a stool to reach the trough's rim. He had been putting his hands into this particular flour, in this particular cellar, and he did not think, even on the hardest nights, that he had tired of it. He made the well in the center of the flour with his fist, a wide, shallow crater, and into it went the water, not hot, not cold, but blood-warm, tested against the inside of his wrist, the way his mother had once tested milk for an infant, a habit so old in bakers' families that no one troubled any more to ask why the wrist and not the hand. Into the water went the reserved leaven, broken up and stirred until it had dissolved into pale threads through the water, and a measure of the fresh compressed yeast, besides, bought from the corner grocer who kept it packed in ice through the summer months, for the leaven alone gave a slower rise and a deeper flavor that Etienne loved in the round country loaves, but a touch of the baker's yeast beside it woke the dough faster and gave the long panes their lighter crumb, and a man who wished to have both kinds of bread ready by dawn had learned long ago not to be a purist about it. Salt went in at the edges, never touching the yeast directly, another small lesson handed down without explanation, until Etienne himself, years later, had come to understand the chemistry of it and found that his father's hands had known the truth of it long before either of their tongues could have named it. Then the mixing began, and this was work that asked the whole body, not just the arms. Etienne folded the flour in from the sides with his fingers spread wide, drawing the dry white powder into the wet well a little at a time, feeling the mixture change under his hands from a thin paste to something with body, something that pulled back faintly when he drew his fingers through it. Julian worked beside him at the near end of the trough on a smaller portion set aside for him to practice on. The boy's hands, still clumsy at this, still inclined to work too fast, too eager, so that the dough came together unevenly, wet in pockets and dry in others, and Etienne watched him without seeming to watch, correcting only when the boy's frustration had built enough to make the lesson land. "Slower," Etienne said once, laying his own broad hand briefly over Julian's smaller one to still it. "You're not fighting it. You're asking it something, and it needs time to answer." Julian slowed. The dough in his small trough came together more evenly, and something in the boy's shoulders eased with it, the particular satisfaction of a hard thing beginning, at last, to go right under his own hands. When the flour and water and leaven had gathered into a single rough mass, Etienne turned the whole of it out onto the floured board that ran along the trough's edge and began to knead in earnest, and this was the part of the night he loved best without reservation, without the smallest complication of tiredness or duty mixed into the loving of it. He pressed the heel of his hand into the dough and pushed it away from himself, felt it give and stretch, folded it back over itself, turned it a quarter turn, and pressed again. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. The rhythm took him over entirely within a few minutes, the way it always did, until his mind had gone somewhere loose and unfocused and pleasant, while his hands carried on the work without him, as though the hands themselves had memorized something that no longer needed his attention to perform. The dough changed under his palms as he worked it, minute by minute, from something ragged and sticky into something smooth and faintly elastic, cool at first from the well water, and then, as his hands warmed it, taking on a gentle living warmth of its own, so that by the time he judged it ready, by the window-pane test his father had taught him, stretching a small piece between his fingers until it went thin enough to show a faint gray light through it, without tearing, the dough felt almost like a creature he had coaxed rather than a substance he had forced. He could have told a stranger, had one ever come down into this cellar and asked him exactly how long the kneading took. He had never once needed to guess. But he did not think in numbers while he worked. He thought, if he thought anything at all, of his father's hands doing this same motion in this same low light, and of his own hands one day teaching Julian's hands to do it, and of the plain, unspectacular contentment of a man who has found the one work he was suited for and has never had cause, not on a single night in 11 years, to wish himself doing anything else. Outside, though neither of them could hear it from the cellar, the gas lamp on the corner burned on unwavering, and a cart went by somewhere with a long, slow rattle, and the city slept on above them, ignorant of the two hands and the four hands together, turning flour into the shape of the coming day. The dough rested under its linen cloth for the better part of an hour, set in the warmest corner near the oven's flank, where the heat came through the brick in a slow, steady breath, and Etienne used the waiting time, as he always did, for the dozen small tasks that never seemed to end in a bakehouse. He checked the fire and fed it 2 more faggots. He scrubbed down the board where the boy had spilled a little water. He climbed halfway up the stair and stood a moment listening to the silence of the shop above, dark and shuttered, the marble counter cool and bare, the brass scale sitting hooded under its cloth like something sleeping, and he felt, as he always felt at this hour, a kind of tenderness toward the empty room that would in a few hours be filled with voices and coin and the particular busy warmth of trade. Julian swept the floor of the fornil with a short broom kept for the purpose, working the drifts of loose flour into a neat pile by the door, and between the strokes of the broom he talked, as boys of 14 will, about things that had nothing at all to do with bread. A dog he had seen in the street with one blue eye and one brown, a cousin newly arrived from Auvergne who claimed he had seen the ocean, the great crowd said to be gathering these weeks at the Exposition out past the Champ de Mars, where a boy from his school had gone with his uncle and come back talking of nothing else for a fortnight, moving statues and towers of light and a wheel, so he swore, that lifted a man higher than any church spire in the city. Etienne listened with half an ear and answered where an answer seemed wanted, and did not say that he himself had not troubled to go, that 6 years of running this shop himself, since his father had handed it over and gone to keep a garden in the country, had taught him there was very little in the wide world he wanted to see that could compete, on any ordinary night, with the small and complete world of this cellar. "Will you go?" Julian asked him. "To the Exposition, before it closes." "Perhaps," Etienne said, which was what he always said to questions he had no true answer for, and which Julian, wise enough by now not to press a grown man's evasions, let drop without complaint. When the dough had risen to Etienne's satisfaction, swollen soft and slightly domed beneath its cloth, giving under a gentle press and slowly, unhurriedly filling the dent back in, he uncovered the trough and began the work of dividing it. This he did by eye, and by the old iron balance both, weighing out portions for the great round loaves, the miches, that would feed a family for the better part of a week, and smaller portions besides for the long pains that the working men liked to tuck under an arm on their way to the factories and the rail yards, still warm, eaten half of before they reached the gate. He cut the dough with a floured hand, no knife needed, tearing it cleanly along the line his fingers found, and passed a portion to Julian to weigh and shape under his own supervision. The shaping of a loaf, Etienne had told the boy more than once, was where the whole of a baker's character showed itself, more than in the kneading, more even than in the baking, because a hurried or careless hand could hide its faults in a fire's heat, but never quite in the honest geometry of a loaf's shape before it went into that fire. For the round miches, he gathered the dough into his cupped palms and turned it against the board in slow circles, tucking the seam always toward the bottom, building surface tension across the top, the way a man might smooth a bedsheet, until the loaf sat before him plump and taut and faintly gleaming, a small firm world unto itself. For the long panes he rolled and stretched with the flat of his hands, working from the center outward, coaxing the dough into its long tapered shape without tearing the surface, until it lay the length of his forearm and a little more, blunt-ended, evenly thick, ready. Julian's shapes were rougher still, a little lopsided, one end of his long loaf thicker than the other, but better this week than the last, and Etienne said so, which brought a flush of plain pleasure to the boy's face that no amount of correction could have produced. This, too, was a rhythm 11 years old to Etienne, though it had begun with Julien only a year and 4 months back. The quiet accounting of a boy's progress, loaf by loaf, night by night. The slow, visible proof that a pair of clumsy hands could be taught, given time and patience and enough nights of flour under the nails to become a baker's hands. They set the shaped loaves to their second rising on the couches, long strips of heavy linen cloth, floured and pleated into a shallow trough shape between wooden battens, so that each loaf lay cradled in its own fold of cloth, touching its neighbors just enough to lean and be leaned on, the way a row of sleeping children might lean together on a bench. The round miches went instead into shallow wicker baskets lined with linen, called bannetons in some shops, though Etienne's father had never troubled with the word, and neither did he, the baskets holding the loose dough shape as it rose, giving it the ridged pattern that would show later, dusted pale with flour, on the finished crust. Over the couches and the baskets, both, they laid more linen, to keep a skin from forming too soon on the surface of the dough, and left them in the corner nearest the oven's warmth to rise a second and final time. Now came the part of the night that could not be rushed by any amount of wishing, and Etienne used the waiting, as he always did, to judge the fire. He had let it burn hard and steady for the better part of 2 hours now, feeding it faggot by faggot, and the brick at the back of the oven's mouth, when he held his palm near it without touching, gave back a heat that made him draw his hand away within 3 or 4 counted breaths, which told him, by a measure no thermometer in the shop could have improved upon, that the oven was drawing near its proper heat, but not yet fully there. His father had taught him the count as a boy, standing him at the mouth of this very oven, with his small hand held near the brick, counting aloud together until the heat forced the hand back, and telling him each time what that count meant for the bread that would go in that day. 5 counts for a fierce heat, suited to the crusty round loaves, 7 or 8 for a gentler heat, suited to delicate things that scorched easily. Etienne no longer needed to count aloud. The knowledge lived now somewhere below the level of counting, in the skin of his palm itself, and he trusted it the way he trusted his own pulse. He rested a moment on the low stool by the trough while the loaves rose and the fire climbed toward its heat. And in that moment, with Julien crouched nearby, scraping dried dough from the board with a wooden scraper, humming some tune he had picked up from the street, Etienne allowed himself the small quiet luxury of thinking of his father, not with any grief, for the grief of that loss was 6 years worn soft now, gentled by time into something closer to companionship than sorrow, but simply with the plain remembering that comes to a man doing alone in the dark the same work his father did before him. He thought of his father's hands, thick-knuckled and pale with a lifetime of flour worked into the creases of them, and of the particular way the old man used to hum under his breath while he worked the trough, tunelessly, not really a song at all, but a kind of low, contented noise a body makes when it is entirely at ease in its own occupation. Etienne caught himself now and then making that same noise without meaning to, and did not mind it. The bell of some church he could not place from the cellar struck the half-hour, faint and far off through the stone above him, and he rose from the stool and went to see about his fire. The fire had burned down now to a deep bed of embers, glowing orange gold and pulsing faintly as the air moved over it, and this was the moment Etienne had been building toward since he first struck the match at 1 o'clock. A wood-fired oven, such as this one, did not bake with the flame itself, but with the heat the flame had driven deep into the brick and stone of its own body, hour upon hour, until the whole mass of the oven held the fire's warmth the way a sun-struck wall holds the day's heat long after evening has come. The fire's work now was nearly done. What remained was to clear it away entirely and let the bare stone floor of the oven, scoured clean, receive the bread. He took up the long iron rake, its handle worn smooth and dark from countless nights of exactly this labor, and drew the embers forward and out through the oven's mouth into the waiting ash pail, working steadily along the floor of the oven from back to front, the embers hissing faintly and throwing up small clouds of pale ash that drifted and settled on his forearms, on his apron, in the fine hairs above his lip, until he tasted it faintly, that dry mineral taste that every baker in Paris carried in the back of his throat without ever quite noticing it as a taste at all. When the floor was clear, he took the swab, a long pole with a wound bundle of wet sacking at its end, and passed it once, twice, 3 times across the hot stone, and the water hit the brick with a sharp hiss and a great gout of steam that rolled up and out of the oven's mouth and filled the low cellar for a moment with a wet mineral fog before it thinned and rose and was gone up through the vent in the ceiling. The swabbing served 2 purposes at once, as his father had explained it to him long ago. It cleared away the last fine grit of ash so that no loaf's crust would be marred, and it tempered the ferocity of the stone's heat by the smallest degree, enough to bring it from a heat that would have scorched black to a heat that would kiss the dough gold. He tested it once more with his bare palm, holding it a hand's breadth from the oven floor, and counted the old wordless count in his blood, and judged it right. "Now," he said to Julian, and the boy, who had been standing ready with his own smaller peel, straightened at once. The peels were long-handled things, flat wooden blades broader than a man's chest at their working end, tapering to a haft that let a baker reach the very back of the deep oven without his own arms ever nearing the heat. Etienne dusted his with a fine scatter of flour so the loaves would slide free of it, and began to load the round miches first, since they wanted the fiercest and most immediate heat, sliding the peel beneath each risen loaf where it lay in its basket, tipping it free with a practised twist of the wrist so the dough dropped from basket to peel to oven floor in one unbroken motion, seam side down, no more than a breath's hesitation between each. He worked from the back of the oven forward, placing loaf after loaf in careful rows, leaving each just enough room to swell in the first violent minutes of baking, without crowding its neighbor, until 18 round loaves, and then, on Julian's own peel under Etienne's watching eye, a first row of the long panes besides sat arrayed across the hot stone floor. Before each loaf went in, Etienne or Julien drew a blade, a simple straight razor kept for the purpose, its edge always honed, swiftly across the top of the risen dough, one clean stroke for the long panes, a shallow cross or a scatter of shorter slashes for the round miches, and this, too, was a thing his father had taught him with more feeling than the plain mechanics of it required, for the cut was not decoration only. It gave the crust a place to give, a controlled seam along which the loaf could expand in the oven's first fierce heat, without splitting wild and ragged elsewhere. And Etienne had always thought there was something almost tender in it. This single deliberate wound opened in the dough's tight skin, so that the loaf might grow into itself properly, might become, by dawn, the shape it was always meant to be. The oven door, a heavy iron plate on a long handle, swung shut, and Etienne wedged it and stood back, and for a moment the whole fornil seemed to hold its breath. There was nothing to do now but wait, and use the waiting well. And this was where the making of the viennoiserie came in, the little luxuries that were not strictly bread at all, but which no proper Parisian boulangerie of any pretension went without. While the miches and the panes took their first violent heat behind the iron door, Etienne turned to the butter. Good sweet butter, kept cool in a stone crock in the darkest corner of the cellar, and to a second, richer dough he had set aside earlier and let rest through the long hours of the first dough's rising, a dough enriched with egg and a little sugar, and folded, layer upon layer, around a thin sheet of the chilled butter, turned and rolled and rested and turned again, a labor he had learned only in the last few years from a Viennese pastry man who had passed briefly through Paris and stopped for a season at a shop 2 streets over, teaching what he knew to any baker curious enough to watch and ask. He rolled the laminated dough out now on the cool marble slab kept for this purpose alone, the same cold stone that kept the butter from softening and ruining the delicate layering within, and cut it into long triangles with a practiced hand, and rolled each triangle from its broad base to its narrow point, curving the ends in toward each other as he set them down, so that they lay along the tray in their little crescent shapes, waiting for their own turn in a gentler corner of the oven's heat, away from the fierce blast that the round loaves wanted. Julien watched this part of the work always with a particular fascination, for it was newer even to Etienne than the rest of the craft, and there was something in the folding and turning that felt to both of them less like the old inherited weight of bread-making, and more like a small private pleasure, a luxury stolen at the edge of the ancient labor. Through all of this, the fire's absence made itself felt in the room's sound rather than its heat, for the oven held its warmth long after the flame was gone, and the fornel had grown quiet in the particular way a kitchen grows quiet when the cooking has passed from a man's active hands into the patient keeping of stone and time. Etienne became aware now of sounds from beyond the cellar that had not reached him earlier in the night, the far-off clop and rattle of a cart's wheels on cobble, slow and heavy, which he knew without needing to see it for a milk cart making its rounds before the city properly woke. The scrape of a broom somewhere above street level, a street sweeper's long besom working the gutter outside some other establishment not yet ready to open its doors. Once, faint and brief, a snatch of a man's low whistling passing along the rue and fading again into the dark. He straightened from the marble slab and wiped his hands, and went to the small barred window set high in the cellar wall, more a vent than a window, through which a thin gray paleness had begun, almost imperceptibly, to seep. Not dawn yet, not nearly, but the first faint loosening of full night's black into something with the smallest suggestion of color waiting behind it. The gas lamp on the corner still burned, small and steady as it had all night, and would burn a while yet before the lamplighter's counterpart came at first light to douse it. But Etienne had learned long ago to read that thin grayness at the high window as reliably as any clock, and he judged by it that the first loaves, behind their iron door, could not be far now from ready. When the time came, He opened the iron door, and the heat rolled out to meet him, dry and enormous, carrying with it the smell that Etienne would have chosen, if any man had ever thought to ask him, above every other smell in the world. The deep, toasted sweetness of crust just turning from gold to brown, faintly nutty, faintly caramel, threaded through with the sharper, cleaner scent of the steam, still ghosting up from the loaves themselves. He slid the long peel beneath the first row of mishes and drew them out one by one, setting each on the cooling rack with a small practice thump, and they came out round and high and burnished. Their slashed tops opened into deep, proud ridges, their undersides, when he tilted one to look, baked to a good even brown, with the pale ghost pattern of the wicker basket still faintly pressed into the flour on top. He rapped a knuckle against the base of one loaf, and it answered him with a hollow drum-like sound that told him, more surely than any clock or any glance, that the crumb within had set properly, and the bread was done through and not merely browned without. This was the sound he had listened for since he was younger than Julian, the sound his father had made him practice hearing on 100 loaves before he was trusted to judge it himself, and it still, after all these years, gave him a small, clean satisfaction each time it came back to him true. The long panes followed, drawn from a shallower, cooler shelf, where they had baked a little less fiercely, their crusts a paler gold, their shape slender and handsome, and then, in the last and gentlest heat of all, the crescents of viennoiserie, which Etienne watched more nervously than either kind of bread, for their thin buttered layers scorched faster than either the miches or the panes, and gave him no drum sound to trust, only the color of the crust, and the particular flaky lightness he could feel through the cloth when he lifted one, and the smell sweeter and richer than the plain loaves, a smell of butter gone lace-thin and caramelized that filled the whole cellar and made even the flour dust in the air seem, for a moment, edible. By the time the last tray came out, the fournil had filled with a heat and a fragrance so thick and complete that Julian, standing near the foot of the stair with an empty basket balanced on one hip, had gone quiet in the particular reverent way the boy always went quiet at this hour, as though the smell itself demanded something like silence in return. Etienne felt it too, though 11 years had not dulled it, the way he sometimes privately feared it might. If anything, the smell of a finished baking struck him now with a fuller weight than it had when he was Julian's age, perhaps because he understood better now everything that had gone into it. The fire built and tended, the flour turned to dough by patient hands, the long, slow rising in the dark, the whole quiet architecture of a night's labor come at last to this single, simple, overwhelming smell of bread. They loaded the baskets, great tall wicker baskets meant to be carried 2 at a time, one braced against each hip, and Etienne carried the first load up the narrow stair himself, while Julian followed with a second, and at the top of the stair the bakehouse gave way to the shop, and the shop, for the first time all night, held another living presence besides their own. Marguerite was already at the counter, tying the strings of her apron behind her back, her hair pinned up neat beneath a small cap, a lit lamp on the marble counter throwing its warm circle of light across the brass scale and the stacked wicker baskets that stood empty and waiting to receive the day's bread. She looked up as Etienne came through the low door with the first basket braced against his hip, and something in her face eased and warmed at the sight of him, the way it did every morning at this hour, though neither of them any longer remarked on it aloud. "You're early," she said, which was what she said most mornings, and untrue most mornings besides, for Etienne kept the same hour night after night with a regularity Marguerite herself sometimes teased him for, calling him more reliable than the church bells. "The fire favored me tonight," he said, setting the basket down and beginning to arrange the round miches along the counter's near end, their crusts still ticking faintly as they cooled, small soft crackling sounds like a hearth settling after the flame has been banked. Marguerite came around to help him, her hands quick and sure among the loaves, arranging them by size and kind with an eye that Etienne had long ago learned to trust as fully as his own judgment of the oven. For if his was the craft of making the bread, hers was the equally exacting craft of presenting it, of knowing which loaves a careful housewife would want turned crust up, and which the working men preferred stacked loose and easy to snatch on the way past, of keeping the scales brass pans gleaming and the marble wiped and the whole shop looking, by the time the first customer's hand touched the door, as though it had always been exactly thus, effortless, inevitable. Outside, the gray at the high windows had thickened and begun very faintly to take on the first warmth of color, a color that was not yet pink and not yet gold, but held some promise of both, and the gas lamp on the corner, Etienne noticed as he glanced through the shop's front glass, burned a little dimmer now against the lightening sky, though it would be another quarter-hour yet before the lamplighter came with his long pole to snuff it for the day. A cart passed close outside, its wheels loud on the cobbles in the morning hush, and a man's voice called something short to a horse, and further off, a church bell. Saint-Roch again, or perhaps its neighbor. Etienne could never be perfectly sure which bell reached him at which hour through the particular baffling of the streets. Struck 5 times, unhurried, each note allowed to die fully before the next began. Marguerite unbolted the door precisely as the 5th note faded, an old habit of hers that Etienne had always found quietly comic and had learned long ago not to remark upon, for she took a genuine pride in it, in opening neither a moment early nor a moment late, as though the whole reputation of the house rested on that punctuality. The bell above the door gave its small brass ring, and the first cold breath of the street came in past her, carrying with it the mingled smell of damp cobblestone and horse, and faint beneath both, the green, wet smell that Paris held everywhere near dawn before the day's traffic and dust had worked it over. The first customer through the door was, as it nearly always was, Madame Ricard, concierge of the building 3 doors down, a stout, brisk woman wrapped in a shawl against the last of the night's chill, her string bag already looped over one wrist from some earlier errand, or perhaps simply carried from habit before any errand at all. She exchanged her few sous for a long pane, still faintly warm through its paper wrapping, and a smaller round loaf besides for the tenant on the 3rd floor, who could not be troubled to come down herself, and she and Marguerite traded the same handful of words they traded most mornings: the weather, a neighbor's ailing cat, the price of butter, while Etienne, already turning back toward the stair with an empty basket, caught only the tail end of it and smiled to himself, without quite knowing why, except that the sound of his wife's voice trading small news across the counter was, to him, as much a part of the morning's proper order as the drum sound of a well-baked loaf. Behind Madame Ricard came others in quick succession now, the shop filling with the low murmur and shuffle of early trade. A pair of workmen, bound for some rail yard or building site, buying their long pains to eat on the walk, tearing the warm bread with their hands even before they had reached the door again. A servant girl sent down from a house on the next street with a covered basket to fill for her employer's breakfast table. An old man who came every morning at precisely this hour for a single small loaf and a few quiet words with Marguerite about nothing in particular, and who Etienne privately suspected came as much for the words as for the bread. Etienne went back down to the fournil to see to the last of the baking, to draw out whatever remained, and set the fire's embers to rest for the day. But even from the cellar stair he could hear, faint above him, the small continuous music of the shop coming fully awake. The bell over the door, the ring of coin against the marble, Marguerite's voice rising and falling, a customer's laugh. And he stood a moment on the stair with his empty basket and let it wash over him, the sound of a night's long solitary labor turning, loaf by loaf, into the ordinary daily commerce of other people's mornings. He and Julien spent the next hour in the last of the fournil's proper work, the work that had no glamour in it and drew no customer's eye, but without which no bakehouse could run a second night, scraping down the trough while the dough's memory was still soft enough to lift away clean, sweeping the floor of loose flour and the fine grit of ash that no amount of care ever quite kept from drifting free, washing the peels and standing them back in their corner, banking what little remained of the fire's warmth, so the oven's great mass would cool slowly rather than all at once, ready to be coaxed to life again with less wood and less labor. Come the following night, Julien worked with the particular loose, easy tiredness of a boy who has done a full night's honest work and knows it, humming again under his breath, and once, catching Etienne's eye across the trough, grinned at nothing in particular, the plain, unguarded grin of someone who liked, without needing to examine why, the life he had fallen into. "Go on up," Etienne told him, when the last of it was done and the cellar stood swept and quiet, the oven ticking faintly as it began its long cool. "Your mother will want you before the morning's gone entirely." Julien untied his apron and hung it on its peg, and paused at the foot of the stair to look back, as he sometimes did, at the fournil in its brief hour of rest. The trough scraped clean, the oven's mouth dark now and cooling, the basket stacked, and the floor swept bare. The whole room settled into the particular stillness that came only after a night's labor was fully done, and before the next one had begun to gather itself. He said nothing, only looked, and went up, and Etienne heard his light, quick step cross the shop floor above, and the small chime of the bell as he let himself out into the now fully wakened street. Etienne climbed the stair more slowly behind him, carrying the last of the day's ledger figures in his head to give to Marguerite. How many loaves baked, how many of each kind, flour drawn down to be reordered before the week's end, small ordinary arithmetic that closed the night's account as surely as the swept floor and the banked fire. The shop, when he came up into it, stood in the full, clear light of a Paris morning, sun falling now through the front glass in a long, warm bar across the marble counter, catching the brass scale and throwing its small, bright reflection up onto the ceiling. The street beyond the glass had filled entirely with the ordinary daytime life of the quarter. A cart, loaded with vegetables, trundling past. Two women stopped in conversation on the corner with their baskets set down between them, a boy chasing a hoop along the gutter, and further off, carried faint on the morning air, the general low hum of a city that had, some time in the last hour without Etienne, quite marking the moment of its turning, become entirely and unmistakably awake. The gas lamp on the corner stood dark now, its flame long since drawn by the lamplighter's pole, an ordinary iron post again with nothing in it to distinguish the night's small vigilant light from the day's plain daylight. Marguerite stood behind the counter weighing a loaf for a customer, her sleeves pushed back, a faint flush of good color in her cheeks from the morning's steady business, and she caught Etienne's eye over the customer's shoulder and gave him the small private smile she kept for exactly this hour, the hour when his night's work passed fully into her keeping and he was, for the day, released from it. He did not interrupt her trade. He moved instead along the edge of the shop, tidying what wanted tidying, restacking a basket that had gone crooked until the customer had gone and Marguerite could turn her full attention to him. "Good bread?" she asked, though she had already seen it, already sold a good portion of it, and asked mostly, Etienne understood, for the small ritual pleasure of hearing him say so. "Good bread," he agreed. "The fire favored me, I told you." She reached across the counter and brushed, with two fingers, a fine ghost of flour from his eyebrow that he had not known was there, a small, unremarkable gesture worn smooth by 11 years of mornings exactly like this one. And there was more tenderness folded into that small brushing motion than either of them would have thought to put into words, nor ever needed to. He ate standing at the end of the counter as he did most mornings. A heel torn from one of the long panes, still faintly warm at its center, though it had been out of the oven above an hour now, with a scrape of butter and a cup of coffee, Marguerite had set to keep warm on the small stove in the back room, and it tasted to him, as it tasted every morning, entirely unlike any other bread he had eaten in his life, though he knew perfectly well it was in every particular the same bread any customer had bought an hour before. There was some quiet privilege in eating the food of one's own night's labor while the labor's ache still sat pleasantly in the arms and shoulders, a tiredness that asked nothing of him but sleep, and gave him, in exchange, the plain, unclouded satisfaction of a night's work honestly done and visibly, tangibly good. The trade went on steady around him while he ate, customers coming and going, the bell over the door ringing its small brass note again and again, coins passing and change counted out, Marguerite's voice threading through it all warm and unhurried, and Etienne let it move past him the way a man lets a river move past while he stands on its bank, no longer quite a part of its current, though he had built, with his own hands, the very water that ran in it. By 8, the morning's first rush had thinned, and Etienne felt, all through his body at once, the particular heaviness that came every day at exactly this hour. Not the sharp discomfort of exhaustion, but something gentler and more complete. A bone-deep readiness for sleep that 11 years of this inverted life had taught him to recognize and trust, and, in its own way, to welcome. He kissed Marguerite's cheek, which smelled of flour and of the lavender water she kept in a small bottle behind the counter, and told her he would be down again by the time the fire wanted building, and she told him, as she told him most mornings, to sleep well and not to hurry himself, that the shop would keep without him a few hours yet, as it always had. He climbed the stairs to their rooms with the slow, satisfied heaviness of a man whose work is entirely and honestly finished. Past the landing where he had paused at 1 o'clock to listen to the city's private night voice, now filled instead with the ordinary daylight sounds of a house and a street, both fully awake, a neighbor's window thrown open somewhere below, a child's voice calling out in the courtyard, the general bright clatter of late morning going about its business without any need of him. In their room the curtains still hung as Marguerite had left them at dawn, and Etienne drew them close now against the climbing sun, and the room dimmed to a soft brown gold half-light, the particular hushed color of a room shut against a morning it has chosen, for its own good reasons, not to keep. He undressed slowly, his movements loosened and unhurried with tiredness, and lay down at last in the bed Marguerite had left warm some hours before, on sheets that still held faintly the shape and scent of her sleep, while his own limbs, heavy now in every joint from a night spent kneading and lifting and standing before an oven's long heat, sank gratefully into the mattress beneath him. Through the drawn curtains the city's daytime hum came muffled and distant, a cart's wheels, a voice calling, the far-off ordinary music of Paris, going about its morning without him, and Etienne Vasseur, baker, listened to it for a few slow breaths, the way another man might listen to rain, felt the last of the night's good ache settle and loosen in his shoulders and along his forearms, and slept.